Chapter 10 Mr. Marvel's Visit to I Ping. After the first gusty panic had spent itself, I Ping became argumentative. Skepticism suddenly reared its head, rather nervous skepticism. Not at all assured of its back, but skepticism nevertheless. It is so much easier not to believe in an invisible man, and those who had actually seen him dissolve into air or felt the strength of his arm could be counted on the fingers of two hands. And of these witnesses, Mr. Wadgers was presently missing. Having retired impregnably behind the bolts and bars of his own house, and Jaffers was lying stunned in the parlor of the Coach and Horses. Great and strange ideas transcending experience often have less effect upon men and women than smaller, more tangible considerations. Iping was gay with bunting, and everybody was in gala dress. Whit Monday had been looked forward to for a month or more. By the afternoon, even those who believed in the unseen were beginning to resume their little amusements in a tentative fashion, on the supposition that he had quite gone away, and with the skeptics he was already a jest. But people, skeptics and believers alike, were remarkably sociable all that day. Hayesman's Meadow was gay with a tent in which Mrs. Bunting and other ladies were preparing tea, while without the Sunday school children ran races and played games under the noisy guidance of the curate and Mrs. Cuss and Sackbut. No doubt there was a slight uneasiness in the air, but people for the most part had the sense to conceal whatever imaginative qualms they experienced. On the village green, an inclined, strong, down which, clinging the while to a pulley swung handle, one could be hurled violently against a sack at the other end, came in for considerable favor among the adolescent, as also did the swings and the coconut shies. There was also promenading, and the steam organ attached to a small roundabout filled the air with a pungent flavor of oil and with equally pungent music. Members of the club who had attended church in the morning were splendid in badges of pink and green, and some of the gayer minded had also adorned their bowler hats with brilliant colored favors of ribbon. Old Fletcher, whose conceptions of holiday making were severe, was visible through the jasmine about his window or through the open door, whichever way you chose to look, poised delicately on a plank supported on two chairs and whitewashing the ceiling of his front room. About 4 o'clock, a stranger entered the village from the direction of the downs. He was a short, stout person in an extraordinarily shabby top hat, and he appeared to be very much out of breath. His cheeks were alternately limp and tightly puffed, his mottled face was apprehensive, and he moved with a sort of reluctant alacrity. He turned the corner of the church and directed his way to the Coach and Horses. Among others, old Fletcher remembers seeing him, and indeed the old gentleman was so struck by his peculiar agitation that he inadvertently allowed a quantity of whitewash to run down the brush into the sleeve of his coat while regarding him. This stranger, to the perceptions of the proprietor of the coconut shy, appeared to be talking to himself, and Mr. Huckster remarked the same thing. He stopped at the foot of the Coach and Horses steps, and, according to Mr. Huckster, appeared to undergo a severe internal struggle before he could induce himself to enter the house. Finally, he marched up the steps and was seen by Mr. Huckster to turn to the left and open the door of the parlor. Mr. Huckster heard voices from within the room and from the bar apprising the man of his error. "The room's private," said Hall, and the stranger shut the door clumsily and went into the bar. In the course of a few minutes, he reappeared, wiping his lips with the back of his hand, with an air of quiet satisfaction that somehow impressed Mr. Huckster as assumed. He stood looking about him for some moments, and then Mr. Huckster saw him walk in an oddly furtive manner towards the gates of the yard, upon which the parlor window opened. The stranger, after some hesitation, leant against one of the gate posts, produced a short clay pipe, and prepared to fill it. His fingers trembled while doing so. He lit it clumsily, and folding his arms, began to smoke in a languid attitude, an attitude which his occasional glances up the yard altogether belied. All this Mr. Huckster saw over the canisters of the tobacco window, and the singularity of the man's behavior prompted him to maintain his observation. Presently, the stranger stood up abruptly and put his pipe in his pocket. Then he vanished into the yard. Forthwith, Mr. Huckster, conceiving he was witness of some petty larceny, leapt round his counter and ran out into the road to intercept the thief. As he did so, Mr. Marvel appeared, his head askew, a big bundle and a blue tablecloth in one hand, and 3 books tied together, as it proved afterwards with the vicar's braces, in the other. Directly he saw Huckster, he gave a sort of gasp, and turning sharply to the left, began to run. "Stop, thief!" cried Huckster, and set off after him. Mr. Huckster's sensations were vivid but brief. He saw the man just before him, and spurting briskly for the church corner and the hill road, he saw the village flags and festivities beyond, and a face or so turned towards him. He bawled, "Stop!" again. He had hardly gone 10 strides before his shin was caught in some mysterious fashion, and he was no longer running, but flying with inconceivable rapidity through the air. He saw the ground suddenly close to his face. The world seemed to splash into a million whirling specks of light, and subsequent proceedings interested him no more. Chapter 11. In the Coach and Horses. Now, in order to clearly understand what had happened in the inn, it is necessary to go back to the moment when Mr. Marvel first came into view of Mr. Huckster's window. At that precise moment, Mr. Cuss and Mr. Bunting were in the parlor. They were seriously investigating the strange occurrences of the morning, and were, with Mr. Hall's permission, making a thorough examination of the invisible man's belongings. Jaffers had partially recovered from his fall and had gone home in the charge of his sympathetic friends. The stranger's scattered garments had been removed by Mrs. Hall and the room tidied up. And on the table under the window, where the stranger had been wont to work, Cuss had hit almost at once on 3 books in manuscript, labeled Diary. "Diary," said Cuss, putting the 3 books on the table. "Now, at any rate, we shall learn something." The vicar stood with his hands on the table. "Diary," repeated Cuss, sitting down, putting 2 volumes to support the third, and opening it. No name on the fly leaf. Bother. Cipher. And figures. The vicar came round to look over his shoulder. Cuss turned the pages over with a face suddenly disappointed. Dear me, it's all cipher, Bunting." "There are no diagrams?" asked Mr. Bunting. "No illustrations throwing light?" "See for yourself," said Mr. Cuss. "Some of it's mathematical, and some of it's Russian, or some such language, to judge by the letters, and some of it's Greek. Now, the Greek, I thought you—" "Of course," said Mr. Bunting, taking out and wiping his spectacles, and feeling suddenly very uncomfortable, for he had no Greek left in his mind worth talking about. "Yes, the Greek, of course, may furnish a clue. I'll find you a place." "I'd rather glance through the volumes first," said Mr. Bunting, still wiping. "A general impression first, Cuss, and then, we can go looking for clues." He coughed, put on his glasses, arranged them fastidiously, coughed again, and wished something would happen to avert the seemingly inevitable exposure. Then he took the volume Cuss handed him in a leisurely manner, and then something did happen. The door opened suddenly. Both gentlemen started violently, looked around, and were relieved to see a sporadically rosy face beneath a furry silk hat. "Tap?" asked the face, and stood staring. "No," said both gentlemen at once. "Over the other side, my man," said Mr. Bunting. "And please shut that door," said Mr. Cuss, irritably. "All right," said the intruder, as it seemed in a low voice, curiously different from the huskiness of his first inquiry. "Right you are," said the intruder in the former voice. "Stand clear," and he vanished, and closed the door. "A sailor, I should judge," said Mr. Bunting. "Amusing fellows they are. Stand clear, indeed. A nautical term referring to his getting back out of the room, I suppose." "I dare say so," said Cuss. "My nerves are all loose today. It made me quite jump, the door opening like that." Mr. Bunting smiled as if he had not jumped. "And now," he said with a sigh, "these books." Someone sniffed as he did so. "One thing is indisputable," said Bunting, drawing up a chair next to that of Cuss. "There certainly have been very strange things happening in Iping during the last few days. Very strange. I cannot, of course, believe this absurd invisibility story." "It's incredible," said Cuss. "Incredible. But the fact remains that I certainly saw right down his sleeve." "But are you sure? Suppose a mirror, for instance. Hallucinations are so easily produced. I don't know if you have ever seen a really good conjurer." "I won't argue again," said Cuss. "We've thrashed that out, Bunting. And just now there's these books. Here's some of what I take to be Greek. Greek letters, certainly." He pointed to the middle of the page. Mr. Bunting flushed slightly and brought his face nearer, apparently finding some difficulty with his glasses. Suddenly he became aware of a strange feeling at the nape of his neck. He tried to raise his head and encountered an immovable resistance. The feeling was a curious pressure, the grip of a heavy, firm hand, and it bore his chin irresistibly to the table. "Don't move, little men," whispered a voice, "or I'll brain you both." He looked into the face of Cuss, close to his own, and each saw a horrified reflection of his own sickly astonishment. "I'm sorry to handle you so roughly," said the voice, "but it's unavoidable." "Since when did you learn to pry into an investigator's private memoranda?" said the voice, and two chins struck the table simultaneously, and two sets of teeth rattled. "Since when did you learn to invade the private rooms of a man in misfortune?" And the concussion was repeated. "Where have they put my clothes?" "Listen," said the voice. "The windows are fastened, and I've taken the key out of the door. I am a fairly strong man, and I have the poker handy. Besides being invisible, that's not the slightest doubt that I could kill you both and get away quite easily if I wanted to. Do you understand? Very well. If I let you go, will you promise not to try any nonsense and do what I tell you?" The vicar and the doctor looked at one another, and the doctor pulled a face. "Yes," said Mr. Bunting, and the doctor repeated it. Then the pressure on the necks relaxed, and the doctor and the vicar sat up, both very red in the face and wriggling their heads. "Please keep sitting where you are," said the invisible man. "Here's the poker, you see." "When I came into this room," continued the invisible man, after presenting the poker to the tip of the nose of each of its visitors, "I did not expect to find it occupied, and I expected to find, in addition to my books of memoranda, an outfit of clothing. Where is it? No, don't rise. I can see it's gone. Now, just at present, though the days are quite warm enough for an invisible man to run about stark, the evenings are quite chilly. I want clothing and other accommodation, and I must also have those 3 books. Hi, can I play?" Chapter 12. The Invisible Man Loses His Temper. It is unavoidable that at this point the narrative should break off again for a certain very painful reason that will presently be apparent. While these things were going on in the parlor, and while Mr. Huckster was watching Mr. Marvel smoking his pipe against the gate, not a dozen yards away were Mr. Hall and Teddy Henfrey discussing in a state of cloudy puzzlement the one eye-ping topic. Suddenly there came a violent thud against the door of the parlor, a sharp cry, and then silence. "Hello," said Teddy Henfrey. "What do you do since you are invisible?" "I read books." "Can I play?" "Hello," from the tap. Mr. Hall took things in slowly but surely. "That ain't right," he said, and came round from behind the bar towards the parlor door. He and Teddy approached the door together. With intent faces, their eyes considered. "Summat wrong," said Hall, and Henfrey nodded with agreement. Whiffs of an unpleasant chemical odor met them, and there was a muffled sound of conversation, very rapid and subdued. "You all right there?" asked Hall, rapping. The muttered conversation ceased abruptly. For a moment's silence, then the conversation was resumed, in hissing whispers, then a sharp cry of "No, no, you don't." Then came a sudden motion and the oversetting of a chair. A brief struggle. Silence again. "What the deuce?" exclaimed Henfrey, sotto voce. "You all right there?" asked Mr. Hall, sharply again. The vicar's voice answered with a curious jerking intonation. "Quite right. Please don't interrupt." "Odd," said Mr. Henfrey. "Odd," said Mr. Hall. "Says don't interrupt," says Henfrey. "I heard'n," said Hall. "And a sniff," said Henfrey. They remained listening. The conversation was rapid and subdued. "I can't," said Mr. Bunting, his voice rising. "I tell you, sir, I will not." "What was that?" asked Henfrey. "Says he were not," said Hall. "Weren't speaking to us, was he?" "Disgraceful," said Mr. Bunting within. "Disgraceful," said Mr. Henfrey. "I heard it. Distinct." "Who's that speaking now?" asked Henfrey. "Mr. Cuss, I suppose," said Mr. Hall. "Can you hear anything?" Silence. The sounds within indistinct and perplexing. "Sounds like throwing the tablecloth about," said Hall. Mrs. Hall appeared behind the bar. Hall made gestures of silence and invitation. This aroused Mrs. Hall's wifely suspicion. "What you listen there for, Hall?" she asked. "Ain't you nothing better to do, busy day like this?" Hall tried to convey everything by grimaces and dumb show, but Mrs. Hall was obdurate. "What?" That's a new word. Obdurate. Obdurate. Can you see your hand? Yeah, can you see your hand? Obdurate. Definition.
Obdurate.
Stubbornly refusing to change one's opinion or course of action. Stubbornly refusing to change one's opinion or course of action. Obdurate. I like that word. Use that. Okay, where was I? Oh, Mrs. Hall was obdurate. She raised her voice, so Hall and Henfrey, rather crestfallen, tiptoed back to the bar, gesticulation to explain to her. At first she refused to see anything in what they had heard at all. Then she insisted on Hall keeping silence while Henfrey told her story. She was inclined to think the whole business nonsense. Perhaps they were just moving furniture about. "I heardn't say disgraceful, that I did," said Hall. "Like as not," began Mrs. Hall. "Hush," said Mr. Teddy Henfrey. "Didn't I hear the window?" "What window?" asked Mrs. Hall. "Parlor window," said Henfrey. Everyone stood listening intently. Mrs. Hall's eyes, directed straight before her, saw without seeing the brilliant oblong of the inn door. the road white and vivid, and Huckster's shop front blistering in the June sun. Abruptly, Huckster's door opened and Huckster appeared, eyes staring with excitement, arms gesticulating. "Yap!" cried Huckster. "Stop, thief!" And he ran obliquely across the oblong toward the yard gates and vanished. I'm going to do oblong because I can't remember what that means. Oblong, an object or flat figure in an elongated rectangle or oval shape, having an elongated shape or as a rectangle or an oval. Okay, where was I? He ran obliquely across the oblong toward the yard gates. How do you run obliquely? That's my question. Obliquely? Not in a direct way, obliquely. In a slantwise. Oh, okay. Obliquely to the street. Obliquely across the oblong towards the yard gate and vanished. Okay, they mean diagonally, probably. Simultaneously came a tumult from the parlor and the sound of windows being closed. Hall, Henfrey, and the human contents of the tap rushed out at once, pell-mell, into the street. They saw someone whisk around the corner towards the road, and Mr. Huckster executing a complicated leap in the air that ended on his face and shoulder. Down the street, people were standing astonished or running towards them. Mr. Huckster was stunned. Henfrey stopped to discover this, but Hall and the two laborers from the tap rushed at once to the corner, shouting incoherent things, and saw Mr. Marvel vanishing by the corner of the church wall. They appear to have jumped to the impossible conclusion that this was the invisible man suddenly become visible, and set off at once along the lane in pursuit. But Hall had run hardly a dozen yards before he gave a loud shout of astonishment and went flying headlong sideways, clutching one of the laborers and bringing him to the ground. He had been charged just as one charges a man at football. The second laborer came round in a circle, stared, and conceiving that Hall had tumbled over of his own accord, turned to resume the pursuit, only to be tripped by the ankle just as Huckster had been. Then, as the first laborer struggled to his feet, he was kicked sideways by a blow that might have felled an ox. As he went down, the rush from the direction of the village green came round the corner. The first to appear was the proprietor of the Coconut Shy, a burly man in a blue jersey. He was astonished to see the lane empty, save for 3 men sprawling absurdly on the ground. And then something happened to his rearmost foot, and he went headlong and rolled sideways just in time to graze the feet of his brother and partner, following headlong. The two were then kicked, knelt on, fallen over, and cursed by quite a number of over-hasty people. Now, when Hall and Henfrey and the laborers ran out of the house, Mrs. Hall, who had been disciplined by years of experience, remained in the bar next the till. And suddenly the parlor door was opened, and Mr. Cuss appeared, and without glancing at her, rushed at once down the steps toward the corner. "Hold him!" he cried. "Don't let him drop that parcel!" He knew nothing of the existence of Marvel, for the invisible man had handed over the books and bundle in the yard. The face of Mr. Cuss was angry and resolute, but his costume was defective, a sort of limp white kilt that could only have passed muster and grease. "Hold him!" he bawled. "He's got my trousers and every stitch of the vicar's clothes." "Tend to him in a minute," he cried to Henfrey as he passed the prostrate Huckster, and, coming round the corner to join the tumult, was promptly knocked off his feet in an indecorous sprawl. Somebody in full flight trod heavily on his finger. He yelled, struggled to regain his feet, was knocked against, and thrown on all fours again. Became aware that he was involved not in a capture but in a rout. Everyone was running back to the village. He rose again, was hit severely behind the ear. He staggered and set off back to the coach and horses forthwith, leaping over the deserted huckster who was now sitting up on his way. Behind him, as he was halfway up the inn steps, he heard a sudden yell of rage, rising sharply out of the confusion of cries and a sounding smack in someone's face. He recognized the voice as that of the Invisible Man. And the note was that of a man suddenly infuriated by a painful blow. In another moment, Mr. Cuss was back in the parlor. "He's coming back, Bunting," he said, rushing in. "Save yourself." Mr. Bunting was standing in the window, engaged in an attempt to clothe himself in the hearth rug in a West Surrey Gazette. "Who's coming?" he said, so startled that his costume narrowly escaped disintegration. "Invisible Man," said Cuss, and rushed on to the window. "We'd better clear out from here. He's fighting mad. Mad." In another moment, he was out in the yard. "Good heavens," said Mr. Bunting, hesitating between two horrible alternatives. He heard a frightful struggle in the passage of the inn, and his decision was made. He clambered out of the window, adjusted his costume hastily, and fled up the village as fast as his fat little legs would carry him. From the moment when the Invisible Man screamed with rage and Mr. Bunting made his memorable flight up the village, it became impossible to give a consecutive account of affairs in I Ping. Possibly the Invisible Man's original intention was simply to cover Marvel's retreat with the clothes and books, but his temper, at no time very good, seems to have gone completely at some chance blow, and forthwith he set to smiting and overthrowing for the mere satisfaction of hurting. You must figure the street full of running figures, of doors slamming, and fights for hiding places. You